Hi class, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, Ancient Mesopotamia and also Persia. I have this subtitle here that I added, it's not from your book, Art in the Service of Kingship, because we'll see that a lot of the work in this period, the function of it, is to serve kings and kind of kingship as well as big dynasties of people. In a couple places, we have a grandson and a grandfather who are kings, so there's like a lineage. And then also there's some really large empires. So this is kind of a general theme that I would want to have you think about as we go through this chapter and the slideshows and presentation. We're going to be looking at this area of the world, Mesopotamia. This is the ancient Near East. We'll look at some different civilizations throughout here. This is an area, especially Sumerians. They invented the first known invention of writing, first epic poetry, the Epic of Gilgamesh, an ancient legendary hero, king who searches for immortality in the underworld is from there. There's economic records, religious texts, and written histories. So we're going to be getting into a different type of history because we have some writing that we have left behind by the people. These are some of the goals I want you to think about. The way in which the Neolithic Revolution that we talked about has changed art and architecture. The concept of civilization and the importance of Sumerian civilization in the Near East. And then we're going to examine some different materials and techniques and subject matters and styles that you're going to want to know about in the Near East. Really, part of the revolution was the way in which crops we talked about were able to be harvested and the way in which animals will be able to be herded. So it created a civilization where they could have city-states and city planning and an organization of crafts and jobs even. So this is something you want to think about, the context of what we're looking at and how they were able to organize labor to build bigger objects and temples and things. We saw that to an extent at the end of the Neolithic era as well. Cuneiform was their writing. It's named after Latin for the wedge-shaped stylus they used to use to create it in wet clay. And because they had writing, we have a lot more insight into their societies and the art they created and the way they thought about themselves in the world and the nature of being and truth and things like that. So we're not doing quite as much guesswork in every case. There is still some based on kind of not knowing exactly what some of the objects meant because they didn't necessarily have a writing about it or something like that. But there isn't nearly as much as we found in the last chapter. I want to show you a article about this. It's on smarthistory.org. If you wanted to look it up yourself at some point, it's online, writing cuneiform. We're not going to watch the video, but I'm going to show you that it's from the British Museum. There's a video by the Getty in the British Museum about it. I'll probably post the link in the module so you can watch this. It talks about how it was written not in ink, but pressed into clay. Kind of interesting stuff here, so I'm going to post this. There's other interesting information on this about the ancient Near East and some of these civilizations for your writing. You might want to know about this. So that's that smarthistory.org for the writing. So I'll post a link to that in the module on its own page. So Mesopotamia is the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. That's what the name derives from the Greek word for middle and rivers. It's basically thought to be, by some people, the cradle of civilization, and there's been reports that some people believe that that's where the Garden of Eden is. The Neolithic ended in 4000 BC, and then this is when we started getting in this area, not all of the world, and that's when urbanization and construction of the first monumental temples and all these things began to happen. The first people group we're going to look at are the Sumerians. And I just want to give you context on the modern map globe where it is. It's right over here. This is what we're talking about. Okay, for Mesopotamia. we're going to look at this city, Uruk, right here. And this is the Sumerian culture. They were farmers, and they did a lot of trading and selling because they needed certain types of things they couldn't get in their own land, like wood and stone and metal. So they were rich from farming, and then they traded a lot, and they were also sailors. They had a pretty complex religious system, and a lot of different gods. Your book talks a lot about it. They have stories about the feats and escapades, where people, like I said, about the epic poem of Gilgamesh, were involved in them. So they had these kind of things preserved in a literature for a long time. Okay. They also had music as a part of their life and rituals as well as parties. They're thought to have skillful like harpists and singers. We're going to see images of that on some of the pieces we look at. That there's actually been musical instruments that they found. And they also were pretty detailed in their bookkeeping, their records on like clay tablets of offerings and their rations and taxes of agricultural work. This is kind of a piece that starts to talk about that idea of bringing things into the storehouse. We're going to unpack that a little bit further. And then they even had a favorite board game of theirs that achieved popularity throughout the Near East, Middle Eastern world at the time. So this is the Uruk period, when prehistory ends with this area with Uruk. We're going to look at that. See that city? Okay. And this is where we find some of the earliest written records. The large city-state was dedicated mostly to agriculture, and then they eventually dominated areas around them as well. And they really had a lot of control over irrigation. They're able to grow crops really well, and a really large administrative system. So this is called a sculptured vase because it's made of alabaster, but it has relief carving all over it. Okay, and you'll see that it's kind of set in registers or friezes. There's three main ones with pictures and these gaps in between. So picture one, gap, picture one, gap, picture one. We're going to look at some of it in detail, have a few close-ups, but there's not a lot of imagery that's really close-up. This is the image in your book that you would need to be able to recognize. It was found in a temple complex for one of their gods, Inanna, in modern-day southern Iraq. And it was an important complex because they would bring their agricultural offerings, and it would be stored in a storehouse for the goddess, and then it would actually be given back, like rationed back to people at certain intervals, like grain that was ground, and then they would turn it into beer. They would brew it with the barley and give it back to them. And so the chief priest of the temple was sort of a ruler. In a way, there was kind of a theocracy, you could call it. This goddess was a goddess of love and fertility, and she was later called Ishtar to the Akkadians and Babylonians. So it's a goddess that appears in a couple of the cultures we're going to look at. So we're going to see in this era some overlap, in this chapter, I should say, not era, overlap between the different civilizations. So basically what we see here is at the bottom, signs of like wealth and fertility and animals and things that were valuable to them, and they grew like grain and animals. And then in the middle we have these different people bringing their storehouses, their stuff into the storehouse. If you notice some type of things we'll talk about stylistically on some of this imagery, one of the things is they all walk on a really thin shelf, if you see. And then up at the top, I don't have a lot of details of it, they're bringing it to the goddess up there at the top. So they believe they had to appease her with offerings like this, and they had hymns that they sung about her. She kind of was thought to be married to a shepherd god, and these are kind of these processional offerings probably did happen in some kind of ceremony, they think, but they're not exactly sure. At least, either way, it depicts the idea that they bring them into her storehouse and then it comes back to them later. There's a lot of conventions in the Near East that we see in their art. It's very flat space. Like I said, they're on a really thin shelf. It's very flat. There's not a lot of depth. Their legs and heads, okay, are in profile, so facing sideways, but their eyes are frontal eyes, so it looks like an eye that would be on the front of the face, right? Right here. And then their chests are kind of turned slightly. See how the torso, you can see part of the front of it? So this is called a composite view or a synthesized view. Your book talks about that. And then in the registers, this is what I'm talking about, how they walk on really thin shelves. There's not a lot of space. It looks like they're almost on a balancing beam. So those are some things that we see time and again in their artwork. This is kind of shows you what their temple would have been on top of. It's like a big platform. And they would have thought of these. This is sometimes mistakenly called a ziggurat. Later we'll see ziggurats that are the same idea. But it's thought of to be a platform for the gods, like a symbolic mountain. And it satisfies one of the basic requirements for sacred architecture, which is a transition space between people and the gods. So they thought of this as a transition space. You would come up to it sort of at a weird angle. And at the top of it up here was what they call it would have been the White Temple. So this is White Temple platform. And they think it probably looks something like this. I was dedicated to Anu, who was for them the sky god, and every corner of it was to a cardinal point on the compass. So north, south, east, west. And that kind of reflects that idea of the sky god. Inside of it, there was a corridor, and there were several rooms in there where they would store things, and people would, the priests would be able to come for like services and meet with the gods, apparently. But also there was this altar in the middle. That's where that happened. That was called the Celia. We'll see those later in some type of Greek temples as well, kind of similar idea of an altar area in the middle. It wasn't for everyone to go inside, like a big mass, maybe like celebration of people, but more of a select grouping of people. The priests are very important type of people in society, so it wasn't like a church service of today where everyone comes into it. That wasn't the sort of regular thing. This processional type of stuff would be everyone. So it wasn't a giant building. They also found some of these interesting seals in the same area. They're for printing. And this is early on in the literate part of society. So they would roll these out on soft clay and leave an impression. And they were used to legalize documents for ownership, inventories, and accounts. And it's kind of this type of writing that's very glyphic. It's like a picture that turns into a character. You can see it here in the earliest written language. It later was used by the same characters were used by the Akkadians, and they became more prevalent of the two cultures. They kind of had some coexistence, but they used their same characters, but didn't have the same language at all. It was very different, but they used the same characters. So we'll see back on the map later when we look at Acadia how kind of they were close to each other, like Canada and the United States. So it'd be like we both speak English, but it'd be like we both use an English alphabet, but they spoke a very different language, which they don't. And then eventually they had more power than us, or we had more power back and forth. That's kind of an idea that we could go for, to give you some sort of notion of it. So there were other types of seals like this that we're using for the same reason, with pictures on them, not just writing. And we'll see some later on in other areas too that are important because they tell us things about people, and they kind of create this long tradition for thousands of years that they have these of like relief sculpture that we learn a lot about the people because of that. So that's pretty interesting thing to know about. We're going to carry on with this culture into the early Dynastic era and look at these things called temple votive statues. So close to this long period, 200 years, are exactly from. These are statues from a temple that was a city in Sumer in modern day Iran. They're made of alabaster, limestone, and gypsum. The tallest of them is about 30 inches. They're called votive statues, that word right there, because it means gift. So you need to know votive means gift. It was a function to like they gifted money to the temple to hope for a blessing. And we think that possibly the bigger the statue, maybe more money was given. There's also maybe this idea of what we've talked about before called hierarchical scale. So the bigger somebody is in a depiction, the more important they are. This is an important thing. The largest figure is thought to be dedicating himself to the sky god, and most of them have a cup in their hands. The men are usually bare-chested. You can see different men are bare-chested, and the women have this one shoulder exposed when they have a dress, and the men have these sort of kilts on. The one who is bald and without a beard is a eunuch, a priest, and then they all have, this is the picture from your book you will need to recognize. You can see the detail of the shoulder exposed. They all have these wide eyes, and the men who aren't eunuchs have beards. Very stylized, right? Where things that are organic become non-organic surface elements. You get a lot of stylization on these. It's interesting because they have these bright, wide open eyes. Dark in color, but like wide open eyes. And they use black pitch for the features. The eyes were probably made of shells or black limestone for the pupils, and fairly complex materiality. They have sort of a cylindrical quality to them, and they're naturalistic in that sense that we could tell they're people and they're more or less as people, but they're not realistic in any way whatsoever. There's definitely a frontal focus on them because their eyes and their facial features, everything on the front. They have these solemn poses because they're gifts to like serve the gods and be before them continually, as well as their eyes are wide open to like be in attendance to watchful for the gods, but also there's the idea that they're wide open because they're standing in the presence of divinity. So there's kind of an awe sense to them too, as part of that as well. It's not known exactly if they were originally grouped like this, because when they were found, they weren't kept in that location, so it's not exactly known what groupings they were in. But that gives you an idea about them. This shows you some inscriptions on some of them. And the cup here, hers is broken. This is the image you need to be able to recognize. So you can see that the back of them doesn't have as much detail on here, just a little bit of it. And that's the eunuch without the bald head. He does have a bit of a beard, but not as long, I guess I should say. I said he didn't have any beard, but he does have a little bit, but not as long. The next big site we're going to look at that was excavated was in Ur. So Uruk was there. Ur's a little bit further south. We're still in Sumerian territory. And it was a royal cemetery at Ur. So-called discovered in 1880 because it obviously had important people. We're not sure exactly if all of them were royalty or not, but they had important rich people because there were golden objects, chariots, harps, headdresses, and jewelry. People buried with really elaborate ornamentation. It's gone through some wear over the years, but still nonetheless. This is an example of like a crazily beautifully made helmet, stylization where kind of organic things become more geometric. And this was found in the site too. It's called the Standard of Ur. Interesting object that was found there. And it was called a standard by the archaeologist who found it woolly, but because he somehow thought it was supposed to go on top of a pole and be like a standard that they raised, but probably was a sound box of a musical instrument. In this site, we also found some mass grave where people were actually killed when probably a ruler died, like a bunch of court attendants and things. It's kind of hard for us to understand nowadays, but Dr. Mong said, but in this culture, these were positions of great honor, and you lived well in the court, so it was a trade-off. Besides the fact that they did not believe the movement into the next world was necessarily something to fear. So it's strange to us, but some of the, this happened in other parts of the world too. When a king would die, his court, like some of his warriors and things, would be killed and buried with him, maybe for the afterlife. So that's kind of stuff we find in that area too, inside this big cemetery. So the standard of here, it's got a war side to it. It says war, and a peace side to it. So that's interesting. So there's a war side and a peace side, and both sides have 3 registers or friezes made out of shell. It's an inlay from wood shells and this bluestone lapis lazuli that's used a lot in their different, really kind of elaborate, beautifully decorated aesthetic objects. They use this in a few of them. And it kind of serves like 2 parts of the same narrative, possibly, people have talked about, or maybe a victory side and a celebration side, or a war and peace side. It's somewhat of a generic narrative, but on one side is this idea of war. At the bottom, the enemy, these chariots with donkeys driving them, crushing enemies down, and they're kind of like progressively more intensely accelerating and crushing. And then above them is like foot soldiers carrying off the defeated, okay? And then up here, they're presenting them to a king, hierarchical scale, larger, and they've been stripped naked to bring them dishonor or shame. And they're being taken to him. Okay, so that's the war side. On the peace side is at the bottom, they're saying provisions, or possibly they're saying it's a loot taken from the people they defeated, depending on how you read the 2 sides working together. In the middle is the idea of animals and fish being brought in for a banquet. So some provisions and food. And then at the very top, the king, the biggest guy, is eating in a banquet. You can see they have like cups, and there's a harpist and a singer entertaining them. So it's this idea of having a peaceful, prosperous society, or possibly to be celebrating their victory. So it gives us some idea about how they thought of themselves, who they were. They were victorious, peaceful, prosperous people. Where they were going kind of gives us an idea of how they buried things, thinking they would need them for the afterlife. These are some of the kind of questions we talked about in the last chapter. Who we are, where we're going, type of ideas that we'll see time and again. Another thing that was found there, which is really amazing, was a bull-headed harp, or a lyre, some people call it. It has an inlay at the front of it. It's been restored. It wasn't found in this good of condition. It's got a wooden core beneath. This is gold leafing on top of it, and this is that same semi-precious stone making the beard. There were several music instruments found, and they actually are functional. They really could work as musical instruments. So it tells us that they had a high degree of craftsmanship, but also that they enjoyed music as a civilization. It was, on lots of things so far. It's made of wood, catgut, strings for animal guts like they use for violins. This bull-headed creature with a beard is likely some kind of mythological ritual meaning. We see a lot of animal-man combos throughout all of art history. Even we saw some in the last chapter. And we'll continue to see them on through the ancient Greeks and Romans and things. So this idea carries on and on for a really long time. The bullhead is, common, and so are lions, because there's an idea of kingly power, strength, sexual potency, virility, all these type of things so bulls are used a lot. And the combination here is basically the beard on the bull. there's not like a man head on the bull body, which we'll see later in this chapter. There's a interesting inlay at the front of it here. This is it from the other side. We're going to look at, but it's not exactly clear what the meaning is on that. This is another version of one that they found somewhere else. So it's not exactly sure what this is, what this means, but they're thinking it might be, it's some sort of banquet, maybe a funeral banquet in the land of the dead. They're not sure, but there's a common theme of art throughout the ages of these man-beast combos and animals acting like people too, even now, if you watch Disney cartoons or something. Here, so at the very top we have this sort of heraldic composition. It's symmetrical on the same, it's the same on each side. Okay, let's look at it here. And it's kind of this guy who's a heroic figure holding a bowl with a man's head on each side of him. It's not exactly sure why he's doing that. Then below him, there's a dog wearing a dagger, holding a table full of like all kinds of things to eat, and then a lion bringing the drinks. So he's the beverage server and the dog's bringing all the good food. And then down below, there's a donkey playing a harp, again with the harp playing, and there's a bear that's steadying the harp right there. And back here, there's another instrument being played by a jackal, and a gazelle with a goblet, so drinking some food. Down here we get a goblet with a gazelle again as well. Are they serving it or drinking it? I'm not sure exactly, and they're not, we don't know. And then this man with a scorpion tail of some sort, which is very kind of bizarre, and we're not exactly sure what that means either. I think the best guess is that it's some sort of afterlife day of some sort of celebration in the land of the dead or something like that is what people have mostly guessed at. But again, we don't have exact writing about this, so we're not for sure about what this means. Also on this site, they found these cylinder seals. This one was in the same tomb. It shows, again, a banquet scene. So we're getting a lot of banquet scenes going on in this stuff. And this shows us that they had a value for this celebration and living life this way. And again, maybe something to do with their idea of the afterlife had to do with banquets and celebration in some way. We're not sure. But this would have been used to authenticate documents. These were prestigious objects. People would wear them around their neck with like a chain because it signified position to be able to authenticate documents. And this is kind of showing hierarchical scale again. People coming up to the ruler here. So they weren't just in the early period. We have more of these later. So it carries on for a really long time as like a relief sculpture tradition to learn about them. So pretty interesting. A couple goals for the next section here. We're going to look at the Akkadians, the Neo-Sumerians, so the culture comes back into power a bit, the Babylonians, and then the Hittites. Want to think about the stylistic and formal ways that their art is made, the iconography, right? The text that underlies it. Be able to identify the cultures by their kind of stylistic things, and then evaluate the way art played a role for power in these civilizations. And then we're going to look at architecture as part of that, the way they built, and also the fact that it operated as power symbols as well. So our next civilization we're going to look at is the Akkadians, but they're a bit later, but around the same era. They spoke a language similar to Hebrew and Arabic, but different, very different from the Sumerians. But as I said before, they used their writing characters, the cuneiform. So it's above where we were looking up here, but still in the Mesopotamian area. We're going to look at a portrait sculpture of the head of the Akkadian ruler. It was found in Nineveh. we can identify him by as a king by this beard, this braid around his head. It's thought to be pretty strongly to believe to be Sargon the First, the founder of the Akkadian dynasty. He reigned over 50 years. He conquered the city-states of Sumer, and then he had this new idea of royal power. Before we had in the Sumerian city-states sort of more of a loyalty to the city-state rather than a particular person. And so he creating this new idea of kingly power going on here. He has a legendary kind of story where it talks about his birth and humble origins, illegitimate birth. He was sent down a river and then raised by another person. So it kind of has some correlations with somebody like Moses. It functions in a sense for a lot of kingly power as a piece that was made to show power, a portrayal of power. Self-confident sort of facial features. It's a very particular real person. There's features like the nose and the lips and things, not just like generic. So it's supposed to be like a portrait, but also show him regal, right? And there's a lot of stylization in the beard, eyebrows, different things, where it's becoming very geometric. But it has a naturalism as well. It's hollow cast copper. That's going on to the next thing. And it's one of the it's life size and one of the largest hollow cast metal cast objects. One of the oldest ones of this size. So life size, the oldest known larger scale casting. Has a lot of energy and rhythm in the stylization, like this movement throughout the beard and then on the hat and these things. The eyes were likely precious stones, and they've been lost maybe because they're valuable, of course, but also there's very, very clear signs of like an intentional desire to like ruin this, not just like fall out, so like to pry them loose, but they think is probably damaged by conquerors as a political statement as well as to get the valuable stones. Because it's this idea maybe ties even further back into our last chapter of image magic or the power of the image. So this idea of hurting or capturing an image to capture the animal we talked about in cave painting, well, maybe there's something to do with this type of idea here too. Possibly the Medes are the ones who did it. If not the power, then at least in the very, very, very least, kind of a statement of political power to say we captured the image of your ruler and we desecrated him. So it's like a political statement, yeah, to do this pretty strong one. So his grandson was Naram-Sin, and this is the first time we're going to see a stele. It's a victory stele. Naram-Sin is Sargon the First grandson, like I said, so that was Sargon the First, and this is his grandson. This functions as a public monument of his victory and his kingly power, and definitely his propaganda and art. So this is where we get this idea of art in the service of kings. He called himself King of the Four Quarters, which means he believed he was like the ruler of the earth. And so we want to talk about that. How is art used to express political ideas of kingship and territory in these societies? Well, we're already getting it very clearly here with these pieces, but I just want to remind you of that as an idea. Let's look at it further to kind of unpack that. This is how large it is in reference to a person. So a stele is an upright slab of stone. We're going to see other ones. Upright slab of stone that's been carved. They often have decorated with images, but also with inscriptions. They were publicly displayed, and they memorialized events. We'll see later examples of like a law code. So you see on this one a lot of imagery and some writing, but they're very, very much propaganda in the sense that they're publicly displayed and they're showing some really specific and intense symbols, I should say, and signals to society. So this is stone carving in relief, and the inscriptions are in cuneiform. There's a symbol right here at the very top with the king. He has a horned helmet. he's king. He's calling himself, actually, they say, for the first time as like a god in Mesopotamian art. First time a king is calling himself that. But he's also at the top, close to the heavens, or ascending into heaven, where the gods and the mountains would be, okay? It's to memorialize his victory over the Libyans. And he's showing his right ear and his right arm, so that's symbolism of power. You can see a close-up here in their society, and a prospering state, okay? We can see the same stylistic conventions. He's on a thin shelf. He's got a composite synthesized view, frontal, torso, sideways feet, and head, but then a frontal eye right there. He's larger than everyone else, so there's hierarchical scale or proportions. And it's that flat space again, even though you can kind of see the feeling of mountain. This shows you the cuneiform right here. You see the idea of mountain, but there's not a lot of depth. It feels very flat. So his army is marching behind him in a very orderly fashion. And there's a fallen foe here, right here. You can see how, kind of see it from an angle that it's not very high relief. It's pretty low relief. So this wounded enemy falls before him, so it's the idea of him striding past or over them. And then down below here, there's even enemies under his feet that he's defeated. He's crushing. And it's interesting if you look at this, everyone is looking up towards the king. See how they're all looking up? Even she is, and even the spear points. So he's like a focal point of the whole thing. And he's here in the mountaintop. So it's definitely about him. He's bigger than everyone else, and everything's pointing towards him. And he's declaring himself to be basically the ruler of the earth, right? And this horned cap of divinity. So he's like saying he's like a god. Not very subtle political propaganda. Not subtle at all. I want to show this to you because I wanted to show you. It's kind of deformed because of its age, but you can see here is where that frontal eye was on it. And the ear is sideways ear, right? And the head looks like a sideways, oops, that's bad, sideways head. And then the body looks like, if you see the shoulders, it looks like his front of his body. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about that composite view, one of your vocab words, so you understand what we're talking about. I've said it a couple times and shown you a couple versions of it. Just want to make sure it's really clear to you. So, what we're talking about there. I think it's pretty clear, but yeah, we'll just, if you have questions about it, make sure you ask, okay? When I say ask questions, I mean post in the discussion boards and email me, ask questions in the course, the question and answer cafe. If you're not sure about something, then make sure you ask, reach out to each other about it, okay? So this shows you that sort of march, of the orderly march of his power, of his troops above his fallen enemies, up to ascend sort of the mountain. Pretty clear ideas here. Not really very mysterious or hard to figure out that he's trying to say he's a badass, basically. So we're talking about Neo-Sumerians now in the culture. This is from about 2100 to 1800 BC. After about a century of these guys being in power, they were defeated by mountain people, another mountain people, a group from the mountains, and then followed by a period of turmoil. And then there was a revival of the Sumerian culture, and they were ruled by kings of Ur. We looked at that city already. Ur, that's where they came out of, that city-state. Gouda was the best-known king of Lagash, a thriving Neo-Sumerian city-state, and he kind of like took over a whole range of the area. There's a lot of portraiture of him in sculpture, and it's all mostly found inside of temples. Unlike the last guy, we have a whole different idea of what it means to be king here. We had this guy saying he's got the horned cap of divinity. He does not think of himself that way. He thinks of himself as an intermediary between the gods and the people. So he's not thinking of himself as a god. So we see that in the way he depicts himself, and he has a lot of depictions of himself. So we get one of the earliest sort of versions of a guy being a patron of the arts, in that he has a lot of versions of how he shows himself, and it kind of gives us a mind into this whole culture. There were other people who were patrons, but the interesting thing about him is that he had so many versions of different statues of himself, sort of similar but a little bit different, that it gives us sort of a different idea. A lot of times his hands are folded in prayer, and this one's particular because he's got temple plans in his lap. He was a patron of architecture and temples, especially, so he believed he had that relationship to gods and particular gods, and this kind of formed an idea of an ongoing basis of the divine right of kings. So he believed that he was an intermediary, God-chosen intermediary on earth. And that's sort of an idea that we'll see in different cultures, different versions of it. Sometimes they think they are like gods, and then other times it's this idea that they've been given their power by God. He has a lot of inscriptions on him, and a lot of the statues that are of him are made out of diorite. This is an image you should be able to recognize. And you can see on his head is pretty naturalistic, but there's a lot of stylization. Sometimes he has this sort of sheepskin cap on his head. Other times he is not wearing, he doesn't have it, but most of the ones I've seen he has it. And his hands are usually kind of folded in prayer in some way, or this one's pretty interesting. He's holding a jar, which is unusual. Your book talks a bit more about that. But on some of these inscriptions down below, it says things about how he depicted himself, like his arms being shown to say that he has strength given to him from the gods, and his eyes looking wide open, which they do a lot in some of these. You see how they feel like really wide open, because he's watchful and perpetually gazing at the gods to help him. So there's a lot of monumentality in these sort of poses. It's kind of contracted neck, and it feels very heavy. And some of them are even say on the side, this is made out of diorite down here somewhere, because diorite was a really expensive material they had to import. So he was definitely not humble, but he wasn't thinking he was a god. But we couldn't say he's like a humble guy, saying he's given power from the gods and he's strong and watchful and all these type of things. But this is another example of one of his that's not diorite. So there's a lot of different versions of him. Pretty interesting. He usually always wears the same type of clothing, a robe over his left shoulder. And he really was concerned with appeasing the gods and serving them, because he believed that's where his power came from. And so that's why he was building temples and giving to temples a lot of the time. Which leads us into this ziggurat at Ur, which was a Neo-Sumerian temple. It has 3 stages that it goes up in, and it culminated with a shrine at the top of it originally, like the White Temple. This is the picture from your book that you would want to be able to recognize. It was faced with baked brick, embedded with mortar, and it was mud at its core. So mud brick at its core, but they baked it for the outside. The stairway leads up to like one entry level up to the very top point. And there's this idea here again that we had before on the platform for the gods, like mini mountains around their city-states that we had before. Well, it's the same idea, like a meeting space between the gods and the people, or a miniature like mountain. And it kind of, interestingly enough, they say if you get and see them in person, they kind of bulge out a little at the center on the walls. They're not perfectly straight out, as they're not perfectly rigid. It kind of gets kind of a complex construction. You can't really see it very well. I guess it's here you can see it a little bit, but not very well. It reflects the aesthetic we saw in their sculpture for roundy type of shapes. So even though it's geometric Apparently they sort of bulge a tiniest bit outward right there. That's an interesting thing about these. I think we could think a lot about these, even though it's a ziggurat and the other one was a platform. We could think about it exactly the same type of way as far as what it was functioning for them to be a platform to meet the gods, a place of worship, temple or shrine at top would have been for a specific people, not for everyone. So this would have been maybe the type of plan that it would have had based on reconstructions, what they think it would have looked like at the top originally. And there would be the same type of processional things oftentimes is what they believe anyway. They think that there would be the similar type of processions and things happening to bring offerings. Pretty interesting pieces of architecture, the way they kind of grow and climb up like platforms up and up and up. So we're going to look at Old Babylonian culture now. This is from about 1900 to 539 BC, so this lasts for a really long time. This warfare of city-states led to the rise and fall of civilization and empires. The Neo-Sumerians were pretty short-lived, and Old Babylon under Hammurabi from 1830 to 1550 gained control of Mesopotamia. So this civilization lasted for quite a while, and we're going to look at Hammurabi. He was one of their most famous rulers, famous for a lot of complex laws that he created, but very particular laws, and also famous for his conquests. Maybe complex is the wrong word to use about the laws. I guess it's more like a full law system is a better way to say it. So he's even more famous for that now than his conquests. This stele was a culturally really important thing. It was so important that even back in the day, it was taken as a spoil of war by the Elamites. So even back in its period, it was thought to be a really important object. And on it is inscribed the law code of Hammurabi, and at the top is Hammurabi and a god, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So he stands before the sun god Shamash, and he is signifying the blessing of his law code. So the reason why he's standing there is because the law code is being blessed. His law code is being blessed by the god. We're going to see how it's expressed in art and why it's so important to the understanding of the ancient Near East. This is the picture from your book. This is in the Louvre. So there's Shamash, there's Hammurabi at the top. And all this below is the writing of his law code. Why am I saying it signifies his blessing? Do you think? Think about it for a second. But if you have a big stone that's upright, publicly displayed, with a law code on it, and at the top is the guy you recognize to be a ruler, and he's standing before some image that you recognize to be a god, and then there's a signal of blessing, then you can see clearly that there's this idea that saying that this law code is from Hammurabi, is blessed by the gods, is intended to be the way it is by the gods. So you can see that this is a pretty strong idea that he's having displayed publicly his power, that his law that he created, the power that he has to create it, and that it represents it's his law of the land is being blessed by the gods. He has the gods behind him, and this is a very much functioning in this way of the state and religion being combined fully together. So the king's law and his power, it creates social stability, but also acts as propaganda, art in the service of kingship, by using the ideas of religion and the gods blessing him, right? This is an important marker in legal history because of the type of laws that were on there too. It's interesting compared to a lot of other laws. But let's look at this image for a second. The king is here. He has a sort of cap like some of the ones we've looked at before. And we have the god here with his his horned cap on. They both have these beards that are strangely turned towards us and stylized. God has the deity has the rod and ring of authority, justice and power. He's on the top of sort of like a mountain. They're at the very top of the stele. And he would be much larger. See how Hammurabi's standing and he's the same height? If the deity stood up, he'd be a lot larger than him. So there's a hierarchical scale coming in there that he's a larger human. Not larger than a human, I should say. But there's kind of an interesting thing happening here. By Hammurabi being the same size as him, we kind of get an idea that he's also important, but he still makes a nod to the fact that he's not a god by the fact that if the god stood up, he would be larger than him. So there's kind of two things happening there at the same time. And we have the same type of stylistic conventions we've been talking about before. Just show you that real quick here. What are we talking about? A thin shelf, the frontal eye, the twisted or synthesized view or perspective, the frontal, and then the feet are sideways, but the chest is front. See that stuff? Seeing it again and again. And then there's that rod and ring I was talking about. So kind of point those things out to you a little bit clearer. Another thing I want to say about this, by this being displayed publicly and this pose that they're kind of facing us, it's showing us that they're communicating with each other. He's blessing this law code. He's standing before him. And then both of these people are kind of facing towards us in some way as the viewer or reader of the law code. And so it has this sort of another level to its propaganda to say addressing the viewer, the person reading it, that this means you must follow it. It's directed at you, and even their body language in some way, albeit conversation with each other, is also facing us. So as an important legal marker, it stands out different type of laws like eye for an eye type of things, punishment fitting the crime. Like if a builder's work collapses and kills someone, then they have to be executed. If a surgeon's hand should be cut off if a patient dies on their table, or if you steal from the temple, you'll be killed, as will any persons who receive the stolen goods. So stuff that keeps the power of society and the structure in place. Some of it is ideas of kind of protecting the weak from the strong, to keep the social class structures firmly in place for stability and not really so much for equity, though there's not a lot of things in this that are about equity. It was written in the Akkadian language, so we see influence of past civilizations here, and it's using the cuneiform. So we see the original characters and the Akkadian language all kind of combining together here to create their influence. Pretty interesting stuff. So we have a carry-on from civilization to civilization, some kind of gods that are the same in a few of them, and then also using the same sort of characters and language. Gives you a close-up of that. I want to show you this one because it gives you the stylization and the beards and things. The way the lights reflect it shows some of it a bit better. And it shows some things like the rod. You can see it there clear. Okay, we're going to look at a people called the Hittites. There were people from central Turkey. They are in the Near East, but not Mesopotamia originally. But they defeated the Babylonian Empire and sacked Babylon in 1595 BC. They lived in the area for a while and then ended up leaving the area, not because they were defeated, they just left it to other people. I guess they didn't want to be there anymore. They have records in cuneiform like the other Mesopotamians, and they're stored and organized them in libraries that were systematized on shelves. And there were thousands of records, so we know quite a lot about them. It's basically the first known full record in an Indo-European language. This is an interesting piece of theirs. They basically defeated the Babylonians. They're in power in this area from 1450 to 1200 BC, so not too long. This was a gate to a citadel, which was a raised and fortified city. And we see lions, we'll see them again and again on the entrances of different types of places. You even see it now in, when you go to older buildings, or if you go to the New York Public Library, there's lions on each side of it. So this is common even now in a way. These are meant to intimidate visitors and the power of the empire and the king, and symbolic to protect from evil. There's a high relief in these. They project from this rock that hasn't been shaped. It's like unhewn mostly a little bit, but it's high relief. It projects out pretty far. So that's one of the only pieces your book talks about for them, but that kind of gives us they're part of the timeline of the area that they took over for a while. And these are 7 feet high, so pretty large sculptures. They've taken some wear on them, but you can see it from an angle right there. The next society we're going to talk about was a unifying force in the area is the Assyrian Empire. And these guys were from about 1300 to 612 BC, so a really long reign, sort of like the Babylonians, and really pretty vile and bloodthirsty people. We're going to examine some ideas about the way their images, like their sculptures and relief in the Lama Su, work as an idea of power and lion hunts and war, and kind of consider what that means and the way they use it. So kind of carrying on with that idea of art in the service of kingship. So at their height in 671 BC, they had a gigantic empire. This is earlier, 824. But they were really, really, really over quite a large area of territory. And their capital city was named after their chief deity Asher, located on the Tigris River. So at the end of Hammurabi's reign, Asher was the prominent city, and its well-documented empire in texts and objects and lots of stone sculpture, relief sculpture that they used to show the might and glory of their kings. By 1300 BC, they had international status as an empire and were communicating with the Egyptians, and then by 671, look how large their empire was. So it kept developing and developing. They were known to be bloodthirsty, violent empire, and they even did things like apparently filleted the dead after they defeated an enemy, like an army. They'd fillet them and use the skins to cover the walls of their fortresses and things like that. And they really boasted in bathing in the blood of their enemies type of thing. So pretty intense warlike culture. These are some reliefs out of gypsum, and we're going to look at a couple different panels and different types of panels, all of lion hunts. They show the king's dominance over his enemies, symbolized by lion hunting and killing lions. Under this guy, Assur-Nisapal, they were a dominant military force. And there's a lot of dynamic energy in these relief sculptures. This is kind of how many of them there were. The British Museum has them. This is kind of shows you how they would have been laid out. There's parts of them missing and damaged, but it's really, I've seen these before. They're pretty amazing. But he was a brutal king. He records boasting of dyeing the mountains with blood of his enemies, and he actually did make pillars of decapitated heads of his enemies. And like I said, he covered his walls with their skins. So pretty intense warlike culture. And it shows these type of things of lions attacking at diagonals. It's very interesting how they don't have a lot of expression on their faces. Like the servants holding up, there's just power, musculature, and power in the lions and the king. So there's a common theme here in all of these, dominance over lions, subjugation of enemies. He's the last of the great Assyrian kings. These scenes come from more than one space. mostly from like relatively narrow passages leading off from the larger rooms. So you would kind of almost see like as you're going between places, this will be a common theme of experience. They're not complete. There were originally some on the upper floor, but they've fallen down when they were excavated. So that's why I showed you in the previous slide how they're not all there. And they're part of the British Museum's collection. This is an interesting one where the king he's on a chariot, so it shows us about some of their war machines and the way that they fought with bows and arrows and chariots and spears. He's shooting at lions while these attendants are kind of keeping some off, and someone's driving a chariot back here. And you can see a lion after a lion after a lion. The huntsmen are fending him off while he's shooting with an arrow. Shows it in like wider detail how many scenes there are of different lions being shot. So it's all a metaphor for him defeating all of his opponents and being victorious. This is a detail from one of them that I think is really sublime. Sort of a lioness who's dying. She's been shot through multiple times. Shows the kind of power in the animals. So, they're showing them to be powerful, strong, intense beasts, because if you're able to defeat lions and they're powerful, then you're even more powerful, right? And there's all military type of machinery. By machinery, I mean chariots, and the weaponry, and the army attendants, the huntsmen. So it's really communicating strongly this idea that we're talking about with their power. They also had these interesting statues, big sculptures, called Lamassu, and they were in their gateways to their areas. There's a few different ones from different places, and they're made out of mostly stone. This is a site where some of the ones we're going to look at were located. And they would go into, like, when you're going into the citadel, they would be on the, like, entryway areas. This is kind of shows you a good view of the side. So these are about kingly power as well. A combination of a bull body and legs with a human head and then wings, and these cylindrical caps on their head, three-corned crowns of divinity. They have hair and a beard and eyes like a normal person. They're very stylized though. On the bull's body, it's pretty interesting. These are relief sculptures because they're still attached to the background, but really high relief. And you can see them here that they actually have 5 legs, 1, 2 in the front, and 3, 4 on the side, because they were supposed to be as if you were striding past them. So you look like them right here. And as you walk past, they look like they're walking past you, letting you in to the gateway. So the 5th leg makes it look like as you walk forward, they walk past you. A kind of playful idea. There's an idea here of the protection of the king, vigilance and walking around and eyes wide open. So they're guardian figures, like the lions from the Hittites. You can see how stylized they were. Their eyes are wide open in protection, and this kind of idea of divinity. So you have a pretty strong idea here that the gods are on the side of the king, the divine right of the king's vigilance, protection, guardian figures going on here, and very much about power. But you can see this close-ups of all that stylization, this geometry on the feathers and on the beard. But yet, even though that's stylized, there's sort of an organic bone structure to the face that feels pretty organic, especially to the bull's body too. The way the legs are and stuff. So there's a mix of stylization and organic sort of quality. We've seen that in almost all the different sculptures, and even from the different cultures, right? We saw kind of the Akkadian rulers with very stylized hair, but then some organic quality to their facial features. Same with Gouda from Lagash. So this is kind of, there's some common stylistic things across the cultures as well. Interesting. And a lot of them with eyes wide open, feeling for watchfulness and divinity and things like that. So that's something else we've seen happening quite a bit. This is the one from your book that you should be able to recognize. A man-headed winged bull. So that gives you, that's the one you should be able to see, be able to recognize. Okay, let's talk about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. By 850 BC, the Assyrians had taken over Babylon. And then in the 7th century, Nebuchadnezzar, there's a Nebuchadnezzar, same one from the Bible narratives, restored some of its former glory. So he kind of took some power back and got some of Babylon's glory back. There's only not a lot existing from his era, but this is one of the things. It's called an Ishtar Gate. It's only existing monumental architecture from his reign. It's glazed brick, and it's from 575 BC, so a lot more specific dating on this one. By gate, it was a gateway or entryway in the city, into the city. And we can see what we mean by glazed brick is that it had glass coating on it. So it was fired and then glass would melt into this glaze. They wouldn't necessarily like have hard crushed pieces of glass, but it was like, if we do like with ceramics today, the right type of materials, if they're heated up, they melt down into glass and they become like glazed ceramic pieces that we can all buy anywhere really easily nowadays. So this kind of gives you an overview of what it would have looked like in its place. And that's a drawing of the same thing. Pretty interesting. Ishtar, we've heard of her before. She's a goddess of love and fertility and beauty. It's the same goddess Inanna we were talking about way back in the beginning of Sumerian culture. So this would have been like a processional gate, not like on the edge of the city, so to speak, like you had to get through it to get into the city, but one that is like an Arc de Triomphe in Paris or a Roman imperial arch. So it's made to be like a processional place. It's made with a round arch, so it's like post and lintel, except for an arch is even more efficient because it pushes the weight down to the post better. So if you have force coming down right here, and then you would usually have just a big lintel, then it could break more easily. But because you have an arch, it's going here. Instead of it just going down straight onto it, it goes this way and this way down to the post. So it makes it stronger to have an arch. And then the glazed brick makes it durable to weather and water resistant, way more water resistant than like some of the mud baked bricks we've seen earlier. On it has rows of bulls and dragons against this blue background. And they're either moving towards or away from the opening, which kind of gives a sense of movement to where you go through. It's pretty interesting. And I think the blue color is really beautiful, actually. So you can see kind of the bulls and dragons there. There's a picture of the bull. And there's a dragon. So again, with the symbolism of animals being power symbols, right? We have bulls, virility, strength, dragons, same type of thing, strength. We haven't seen dragons before, so that's kind of a new thing, but same type of idea. This piece has been restored and it's in a museum in Berlin. This is the picture from your book that you need to be able to recognize. All right, so we're on to one of our last cultures in this chapter, the Persian Achaemenid culture, also called that. It's a culture and style of the Persians. Achaemenid is named after Achaemenon, who was the founder of their dynasty. It's a late 17th century. Babylons and the Medes unite against the Assyrians, and then Cyrus the Great leads the Persians to victory against the Anatolians in 546, and then he defeats the Babylonians in 539. So there's kind of this unfolding of power in the area where we have the Babylonians and Medes defeat the Assyrians, and then Cyrus the Great takes the Persians and defeats the Anatolians and then the Babylonians in 539. So there's a whole, fighting, and they become the main power, uh, dynasty, power, empire in the area. So these are a couple of the goals with the Persian culture. We want to know about the location, extent of their impact, and kind of identify some of the hallmarks of their art and architecture. This is how large their empire was at some point. And we have, I think when we get into the Greek chapter, we'll talk about how the Greeks defeat the Persians at a certain time, and then they become kind of think of themselves as the most amazing people group on earth. But we're not going to get into that yet. But this will be that same Persian empire we'll be talking about when we talk about that. So a really vast empire over a whole huge swath of land. We're going to look at a palace in Persepolis. So Cyrus the Great united the Medes and Persians, and he had this empire that's even larger than the Assyrians. But the Assyrians influenced the Persians, especially in the way that they celebrated kingship on a grand scale. And they didn't have temples in this society. They had religious rituals that were outdoors. There were fire burning altars. They were Zoroastrians that were believed in two central forces of light and dark. So most of the architecture we see are these really elaborate palaces, and this is the most famous of them. So it's celebrating kingship and the state more than religion exactly, where some of the things we've looked at are more specifically religious. This is the book image that you have here, looking out over their huge hall where the king could have up to 10,000 people standing in his presence. And this is started by Darius the First and worked on by Xerxes and Artaxerxes later. It's built up on a stone platform in multi-structured rooms. So it's really large complex. You can see all the pillars are a huge part of it, in the way that the whole thing's laid out was built on by successive kings. You get some of these lamassu here left over, and shows you some of the pillars and the ruins. The audience hall was the most important hall in the palace, and it's a columned room where the king receives his dignitaries. It had hundreds of columns of 40 feet high and originally painted. So that's pretty amazing. This is the entryway up to it, the drawing of it anyway, I should say. And we're going to look at some reliefs that are on the stairways up to it, that are looking at them like right here, that are really important. Some of them would be in different places like that. It has members of the royal guard on there, and then there's also this long processional of people offering gifts to the king. So it's pretty amazing. So this is the royal guard, and then there's a close-up here, I hope I have, of a lion attacking a bull. Again, these symbols of lions and bulls of power. So the king's guard, and then a lion attacking a bull. So we see the influence of like the Assyrians here with the lions. And then all up here are these different people bringing the king gifts. So there's a grandeur of kings and this processional. This, I think, actually happened. It was propaganda, but it also was an actual thing that the king would receive a yearly tribute from the subjects of his vast empire. And it's kind of got propaganda in it, in that it's happening, and that they're actually complying. But also, it's kind of used to show that he's a benevolent king, that he's not violent against them if they come and bring him things. And very much impressive, sculpture, impressive hall with all these giant columns. It's all about grandeur, right? And it shows you the type of close-up of the type of things they'd be bringing him. The society wasn't like the Assyrians. It was administered in a more orderly and tolerant way. It wasn't quite so bloodthirsty. And so this kind of shows that idea too. Like, if you comply and come and bring your offering to the king, then you'll get his blessing. So this is that type of a scene here. This is a drawing of what the the scene of the hall probably would have looked like. These are the capitals. This is a columns, so the base, a shaft, and a capital at the top. And we're going to be talking about some different capitals that would have been on here. So there's three parts to a column: the base, the shaft, and the capital. The term is Latin for head. And in this hallway, there would have been different types of ones on the top. Some would have been griffins, which are eagle-headed winged lions. There would have been lions on some of them, and then man-headed bulls, and then these ones that they have are bulls here. There would have been a lot of these too. So same kind of creatures of power going on here. And you can see that it's double-headed at the top. Compressed muscular strength going on here. We have the idea of power and kingship, right? Again and again, lions and bulls. It's like I'm repeating myself a lot because it's what we keep seeing. But this width of the capital of the column helps also support the beam because there's more surface area for the weight to be distributed down into the column. Okay, but you see it right here, this strength and compression, and then stylization. Really kind of beautiful. And it's supposed to show that if you think about having a room that you're in that's able to fit like 10,000 people, giant room with 40-foot columns all throughout it, and they're all with like power creatures looking down at you. See, they're looking downward at you. This is not like a subtle symbol, right? You're inside of the structure, and if on your way in you were watching people bring things to the king, and you went past symbolism of his guard, his army, and symbolism of lions attacking bulls, and then you went all the way into this space, and you went past all these things, and you saw imagery of people giving things to the king and giving them their homage, right? And all these creatures are looking down on you. I think we're talking about something that's pretty meant to inspire a lot of fear and trepidation and honor, right? It's pretty clear that this is very, very much art that's serving has a political value, nationalistic value. Looking down at you, these giant creatures, right, from 40 feet up. There's really strong service of kingship and power through this art. So we'll see this again with the Romans quite a bit as well, how people use art to communicate power. It's a very common theme. The Persians were also fine metal workers. This is a drinking vessel out of gold. This one's from your book. It's like a form of a winged lion, so it's not quite a griffin, but it's made in different pieces and then joined together. So got elegance, and we see the same type of viewpoints of combined creatures and sort of stylization on this, and that muscular tension, compressed muscular tension, like the bulls. So that's why I want to show you that. It's kind of got a common theme in their style. That they think maybe they borrowed a bit from the Scythians, who have this sort of feeling in their animal, just kind of turning into a feeling of another animal. Either that, or they influence the Scythians, who are also one of the civilizations sort of in that area, but up towards the mountains, the steeps of Ukraine. So Persian dominance of the Near East came to an end in 331 with Alexander the Great. He conquered Persia and created the largest empire the world had known from the Greeks in 331. So after that, the Greeks were the badasses of the ancient world. So that's kind of brings us through to the end of your chapter 2 about Mesopotamia and the Near East. So you're going to want to be able to recognize those images from the book, and you're going to want to kind of study the guide that I gave you about different words you need to understand, and the different types of imagery and vocabulary that you're going to look at, and then be able to talk about some of the different cultures. And in the writing assignment, we're going to have some discussion questions. Each chapter has some questions I'm going to post. These are examples. I'll actually post the assignment, and then I'm going to adjust these, but these are the ones I was thinking about. We're going to discuss artworks, and give examples and identify some of the lasting influence of the cultures like Sumerian and Persian cultures. And your book talks a lot about it on each other and even today. So I'll actually adjust the discussion questions. Don't answer these ones from the video, but I just want to say to you that there's going to be a writing assignment like I talked about in the syllabus, and you've already had one for each chapter of the book, so be ready for that as well. And then for your tests that you'll have, your quiz for this chapter, you're going to want to make sure that you're looking at the book, reading the chapters, watching all this stuff, and also just using those slide lists to be able to recognize the images and to understand some of the important terminologies and things like that. So keep up with all the stuff, guys. You're doing a great job, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.